It's great to see all of you. I've had a great 3 days here. Tuesday morning, I went out with Brad and the class, the first year graduate class, Alfie's class and Brad's class, and we looked at a granite outcrop for the design elements there in a natural system. Had a great time. And then today, with Alfie's class, we did the drawings on the wall here. This sort of epitomizes the design with music idea that I've been kind of interested in for quite a number of years and been doing with students for quite a while. So it has just been really fun. And these drawings, each of these plans, I think it was a 12-minute piece of music that they created these designs for a real site and got their creative juices flowing. And it was just really very exciting for me and I hope for them. And thank you all for coming. Well, the book that we're going to talk about tonight is Beauty of the Wild, and it has been published by the Library of American Landscape History, which was started 29 years ago by Robin Carson in Amherst, Massachusetts. And since then, they've published many books on landscape history, on landscape design, building up the repertoire of reading in that area tremendously. And so next year they will be celebrating their 30th anniversary and have a long list of books which will be shown in a little bookmark you can pick up back by the books, in fact. But the Library of American Landscape History is an important element, certainly. Dan Natanichek from Georgia is the chair of the board of the Library of American Landscape History now, and I can't say enough good about them. And this book is sort of a premiere for them in that this is the first book that is being published under the LALH imprint. Previously, they've published through University Presses, University of Massachusetts, University of Georgia Press. So this is kind of a new venture for them, and I'm kind of pleased and honored to be the first author with that book imprint on it. I'll say just a little bit about the nature of the book. Essentially, it is a memoir, and I once heard Jill Kerr Conway, who wrote memoirs, give a lecture in which she said, memoirs are a special type of fiction. And mine isn't fictional, of course. Mine is truth throughout. But I'm reminded also of a comment by Laura Ingalls Wilder of Little House on the Prairie and Little House in the Big Woods. And her books were basically memoirs too, memories of her childhood. And she said, I always told the truth in my books. Well, maybe not the whole truth. So I might have been a little selective as well. But anyway, what I'm going to try to do is to read some of the pages that I particularly enjoyed writing and hope you'll enjoy hearing as well. One piece of advice that Robin Carson, the executive director of the Library of American Landscape History, gave me was just tell stories. So this is basically a bunch of stories, starting with 1937 when I was born. But I want to really focus on the places and the people that have influenced me over these last 84 years. And each of us has our own set of people and places that have done that. And mine started in the prairies of the Midwest, and it still has a grip on me. And after my time in Georgia and a decade in New York, I went back to Wisconsin, partly for family reasons, but also because the landscape attracted me back. I spent many hours with field classes in Wisconsin, looking at prairies, oak forests, maple forests, oak savannas, wetlands, and looking at the patterns of vegetation. And so I have gone home again, so to speak, returning to Madison. What else should I say? Oh, I was going to mention that my good friend Ian Firth, who is in Athens, and my colleague for many years at the University of Georgia, I'll be seeing him tomorrow. but I'm reminded that about 20 years ago, he and I were going to a lecture given by Yi-Fu Tuan, the Chinese-American geographer, and he was giving a talk at the geography department here, and we went over to hear him, and Yi-Fu Tuan's first words were, "This is the last time I will be giving a lecture at the University of Georgia." He was 70 at the time, he's 90 now, and living in Madison, Wisconsin. But anyway, on the way back from the lecture, I said to Ian, maybe I'll start using that line. Everybody really listened because he said this may be the last time. So I'm not going to say this may be the last time because, Ian said, when I said, I'm going to start using that line, and he said, better be careful, they may applaud if you think. So I'm not going to risk that. I'm not going to say it's the last time. Could be, but I'm not going to say it. Okay, well, let's get on with it a little bit. Again, I want to really talk about places and people that have influenced me, and then a little bit toward the end about actual projects, but the stories related to those projects, which I hope will be of some interest. So I'm going to start on the farm in Iowa, and we called that farm our place. We had a place in the world, and that place was our farm. And we didn't call it our farm, we called it our place. And our neighbors' places were the Mitchell place, the McBride place, the Strong place. And I like that idea that we have a place. So let me do a little bit of reading from the early part of the book about our place. Our place was 2 miles west and 1.5 miles north of Orient, Iowa, on State Highway 25. Directions in Iowa were always expressed in terms of the 1 mile north-south, east-west grid laid over the state's flat to rolling topography during the initial land survey begun in the 1830s. Our place was a quarter section, or 160 acres. The grid was manifested visually by straight east-west and north-south county roads every mile. Within each of these square mile sections, there were typically 4 farmsteads, usually with a rectilinear windbreak on the north and west sides of the cluster of buildings, the house, the barns, and the sheds. Before the square mile grid was established, 85% of the area that became the state of Iowa in 1846 had been covered by tall grass prairie, 30 million acres of tall grass prairie in Iowa. Our place was at the heart of a vast 640 million acre mid-continent prairie where there'd been a human presence for 12,000 years. When European explorers arrived in the early 19th century, they often described this nearly treeless landscape with its waves of dominant grasses as an inland sea. Big bluestem, little bluestem, Indian grass, switchgrass, northern prairie cordgrass, prairie dropseed, and needlegrass accounted for 90% of the biomass in the prairie. Dozens of forbs, broadleaf flowering plants, butterfly weed, prairie phlox, spiderwort, shooting star, puccoon, bergamot, pale purple coneflower, sunflowers, goldenrods, and asters among them drifted through the grasses, an ever-changing impressionistic blanket of color over the land. A combination of climatic factors and fires, both lightning-caused fires and those set by the Native American populations, had kept the prairie in a nearly treeless state for 100 centuries. One exception was the bur oak. With its thick bark and drought tolerance, and it persisted in the prairie as scattered individuals and in small groves. Initially, early settlers from Europe and the eastern United States were skeptical of land that didn't produce timber. They soon recognized, though, that the deep topsoil built up by the prairie plants over 10,000 years was potentially some of the richest farmland in the world. But the dense, fibrous root system of prairie plants extending down as much as 15 feet made it nearly impossible to break the prairie sod with the wood-bottom plows that existed then. But in 1837, everything changed. In that year, 100 years before I was born, John Deere invented the steel-bottom plow, which is capable of breaking the tough prairie sod. Within a surprisingly short period of only 2 or 3 decades, prairie vegetation disappeared from vast areas. It has been estimated that 99.9% of Iowa's prairie was plowed under. The sea of native grasses waving in the nearly constant wind was replaced by a patchwork of imported species: wheat, corn, oats, red clover, sweet clover, alfalfa, and soybeans. And again, on our farm, almost all of the prairie was removed. But when I was growing up, there were 2 holdouts on our place where a native prairie species remained. One was a half-acre wet slough adjacent to the creek, the small stream that cut through the middle of the farm. Dad had purposely saved this area, not putting drain tiles in it, because the slough grass, or northern prairie cordgrass, made a good water-repellent topping for hay. The cordgrass had another less flattering name, ripgut grass, from the sharp sawtooth edges of its 6-foot-long arching leaves. It clearly earned the ripgut designation, and we wore protective clothing whenever we cut and pitched it to the tops of haystacks. The other refuge for native plants was in the right-of-way of State Highway 25, the east boundary of the farm. As a young child, I discovered delicately fragrant roses, prairie roses there, along with bee balm, yellow coneflowers, and pale purple coneflowers. I often picked bouquets for my mother, who placed them in mason jars as centerpieces on our kitchen table. Okay, now let's move on a little bit. I will mention parenthetically, too, that from the time I was about 6 years old, each of the 3 sons in the family had our own little garden plot. We started with just a little 10-foot square area within the big vegetable garden. And when I was 6 or 7, I planted peas and radishes, lettuce, because they were so quickly rewarding. And I think that may have had an influence on me, that growing things. And then I worked in the big garden after that, the acre of vegetables with annual flowers on the farm, our place. So anyway, that's where my beginnings are. My roots mingle with those of Big Blue Stem and Little Blue Stem in the prairie. Now I will mention also, once I got a little older, 12, 14 years old, I became in charge of the flower borders and plants around the house and the farmyard. And I'll just say a little bit about that. From junior high school through high school, I became the self-appointed garden designer of the flower beds and borders near the house. I took my assignment seriously, poring over the new Burpee seed catalog when it arrived in the mail each January. Long winter evenings were spent pondering the year's order for seeds and bulbs. For several summers, I planted a tropical-looking bed around the chicken pen near the house, consisting of a half circle of gigantic castor beans. Surrounding the castor beans was a semicircular row of scarlet and yellow cannas, and in front of them a row of scarlet sage. Subtlety never entered into the equation. Then there was the 4-foot wide border along the hot west-facing wall of the house, which changed from year to year and included one particularly memorable planting of royal purple petunias with Burpee's yellow pygmy marigolds. What a pair. Anyway, let's move on a little bit. Well, from the farm, I went to Iowa State College in Ames, Iowa, where I enrolled in landscape architecture as a freshman. And I remember my freshman year, we were taking all the basic required things, math, English, psychology, and so forth. But I picked a 1-credit elective that made a big impact on me, and it was a music appreciation class taught by Dr. Alvin Edgar in a beautiful auditorium on Iowa State campus. And I'll just say a bit about that. During my first semester, as I made the adjustment to college life, Alvin Edgar's music appreciation class became a highlight of each week. In the wonderful semicircular Morrill Auditorium, with its curving balcony and excellent acoustics, Professor Edgar introduced us to a whole new world of music, from Gregorian chants to medieval, Renaissance, and Romantic. When he played The Moldau by Bedřich Smetana, I was transported by the composer's portrayal of the Moldau River in what was then Czechoslovakia, as it grew from a trickling stream to a broad sweeping river with a folk dance and a tumultuous thunderstorm along the way. And parenthetically, I should point out that the drawings you see on the wall were designs done by grad students this very morning, to that music, the Moldau by Smetana. And again, there's the river theme does show up in these designs as well. But it really has been an influence to me. And I'll mention again parenthetically that Jens Jensen, the famous Danish-born landscape architect in the 20th century in this country, talked about the relevance between music and landscape and how they are closely related. And I really believe that. Okay. Now let's jump ahead. After I was in the Army, at Iowa State, I worked for a year, and then I was drafted into the U.S. Army back in that era, 1960. And my next new landscape at that point was the central Texas landscape of Fort Hood, where I saw prickly pear cactus probably for the first time, and really dry xeric environments. And I'm not reading from the book now, I'm just recollecting. I do remember being out on bivouac, as we called it, playing war games, and sitting outside my little tent at night, looking at the prickly pear cactus and the various grasses and diminutive little flowers. And I thought how much more fun it would be to be there looking at plants and drawing them and learning their names. But I didn't get to do that then. I was too busy throwing my hand grenades and all that good stuff. But then I spent my 2 years in the Army, and my first real job in landscape design was with the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission in Silver Spring, Maryland. And there I had a boss whose name was Joe Condis. Joe had been a student at Penn State University, and he'd been a student of a landscape designer named John Bracken. And John Bracken was an early ecologically based landscape architect. I don't know that he called it that at the time, but definitely he looked at the ecology and the native plant communities of the region. And anyway, John Bracken had Joe Condis buy a book called American Plants for American Gardens, co-authored by an ecologist and a landscape architect. The ecologist was Edith Roberts. The landscape architect was Elsa Raymond. They taught at Vassar, and they wrote this little book, American Plants for American Gardens. It was published in 1929, and I read it, and it just made so much sense. They talked about looking at the composition of natural communities in different microenvironments, different habitats in New York State near Vassar. And then they wrote about incorporating the plants from those different communities into designs. And it just made so much sense to me. And it really inspired me to, number one, do that. But more than that, it inspired me to go back to college to get a master's degree. And I wanted to go where I could get a good dose of ecology. And I ended up choosing the University of Wisconsin, which was well known for its ecology programs at that point and beyond. So I'm going to jump now to that part of my life. So big influences: the farm, then Iowa State, then the Texas landscape, and now American Plants for American Gardens. And then this led me to go to the University of Wisconsin, and at the Arboretum there I saw Curtis Prairie, the first restored prairie in the world, and now has a landmark designation for that. And as I looked at the Curtis Prairie, for example, I saw how beautiful it was, and I found it fascinating that it had been, quote, designed by scientists, by ecologists, and again reminding us that there is definite linkage between the two, and we should bring them together, not separate them. Well, and then I learned from Curtis Prairie, and more I wanted to bring the native landscape into people's lives, the places where they lived, places where they went to school. And And that led me then to really come to look at the work of Jens Jensen, the landscape architect I mentioned, born in Denmark, who came to this country and worked in the Chicago parks for many years. And then in 1935, established a school in Door County, the peninsula that goes up into Lake Michigan. And there he started the School of the Soil, he called it, and called the place the Clearing. And the clearing was not so much an opening in the woods, it was a clearing of the mind in his observation. I'll just quote him a little bit and some of the ideas that inspired me. In one instance in his book, Siftings, he said, "Parks and gardens of curves are always new, always revealing new thoughts and new interests in life. Landscaping must follow the lines of the free-growing tree with its thousands of curves." And then he said on the subject of white birches, "Birches in moonlight are real companions. No other tree speaks so beautifully as the birch in full moonlight." And he talked about placing birches in the moonlight where you'd see them during the night, get up during the night, look out and see birches. Then he also talked about birches with amelanchiers, white flowering amelanchiers in the moonlight. So he really thought about the experiential characteristics of the landscape. And in many of his projects, he incorporated council rings, fire rings, so to speak, and he based this both on Native American history and Scandinavian, where people would gather in circles. And he says of council rings, "In this friendly circle around the fire, man becomes himself. Here there is no social caste. All are on the same level, looking each other in the face. A ring speaks of strength and friendship and is one of the great symbols of mankind." So he did a lot of council rings. I have followed suit in some ways and incorporated council rings into a number of designs. Now, I taught at Wisconsin, taking students to the clearing and teaching at the clearing itself for a long period of time. And in about 1982, I got this letter from the University of Georgia saying, would I be interested in applying for the job that Sonia has now, the dean of the College of the School of Environmental Design at that time. And I thought, oh, what do I have to lose, Gary? So I thought, well, I'll throw my hat in the ring, never thinking I would get the job. And then I saw the list of other candidates. I was convinced I wouldn't get the job, but I came down anyway and did an interview. I didn't hear anything for a long time, so I thought, well, that's all right. I'm happy in Wisconsin, no big deal. And then finally I got a letter asking me if I would take the job. And why I should say for the interview, not thinking I would get the job, I was really relaxed. I just really had a good time meeting the faculty and students and just thinking there wasn't any pressure because there's no way I would be selected anyway. And lo and behold, I was. And lo and behold, I came. And that was really the beginning of a great era in my life. And again, more sources of inspiration. And just as I had done in Wisconsin, teaching field classes on native plant communities, I and Dr. Sam Jones of the botany department developed a new course here at Georgia in 1984 called Native Plant Communities of the Southeast. And the following year, Georgia instituted a intersession in the spring, a 3-week period, and that was ideal for a field course too. So we proposed a field course on plant communities, and again, it was approved. And here I was teaching in the Southeast in native landscapes. And there's some landscapes that have particularly appealed to me. Having been a son of the prairie, I really liked landscapes that had grasses in them, the movement of the grasses that many of you have observed. And actually, initially, when I started becoming so attracted to these Southeastern landscapes, I felt a little guilty, like I was being unfaithful to my first love, the Midwestern prairie. But I resolved that. I figured I could love them both, and there wasn't nobody got hurt. But three or four of the plant communities that really, really appealed to me were the grassy balds in the high elevations in North Carolina. And there's some passages in the book that I will talk about. Anyway, for a time I felt something akin to guilt for being unfaithful to my first love, the Wisconsin prairie, but soon recognized the similarities shared by native landscapes in the Midwest and the Southeast. For example, the grassy balds in the Smoky Mountains of North Carolina and Tennessee were open to the sky and the clouds, with grasses and sedges that waved in the wind, ocean-like, to the horizon. My favorite grassy bald for class field trips became the black balsam knob along the Blue Ridge Parkway in North Carolina. Rising more than 6,000 feet in elevation, the knob is home to mountain hairgrass, mountain oatgrass, a fine textured matrix punctuated in summer with the blue of diminutive bluets, the orange of Gray's lilies, the chartreuse green of hay-scented fern, and the orange of an occasional flame azalea in bloom. Like the prairie, a grassy bald evokes a sense of freedom and vulnerability. Exposure to rain, wind, and lightning. On one occasion, the line of students following me to the top of Black Balsam Knob broke into the heroic chorus of "Climb Every Mountain" as I became briefly Baron von Trapp. I had this one class that couldn't help breaking into song. It was a lot of fun. Oh, and then we also on one occasion saw a tree whose name is Silverbell, and I said, "Oh, this is Silverbell," and I heard a chorus in the back, "Silverbell, Silverbell." That's fun. And then my favorite landscape in the Piedmont, where we are now, were the granite outcrops. And many of you in the room were at Rock and Shoals Granite Outcrop with Alfie and me and others on Tuesday. But I'll say a little bit about that. My favorite site to go to was Haggie's Rock, 100-acre preserved outcrop bought by the Nature Conservancy and managed by them. Anyway, the 101-acre site owned and managed by the Nature Conservancy is largely an open, sunlit community with expanses of dark gray rock or gray streaked with pinkish to rust-colored tones, covered in patches of brown to emerald green mosses and silvery gray to bluish green lichens. Soil depth varies from none on the bare rock to shallow soils supporting broom sedge, along with drifts of yucca and plants such as the yellow-flowered Confederate daisy and purple-flowered dwarf blazing star, blooming together in September. And we saw one of them Tuesday. Anyway, in somewhat deeper soils, shrubs like sparkleberry and various sumac species flourish, and islands of still deeper soil sustain dwarf versions of blackjack, post, and Georgia oaks, along with red cedars and stunted loblolly and shortleaf pines. These woody species often partially enclose various size rooms within the overall complex. Ephemeral pools seasonally display their own suite of diminutive and often rare and endangered species. In early spring, patches of the tiny red-leafed elf orpine or Diamorpha smallii ooze over the shallow, gravelly zones surrounding the ephemeral pools, giving the landscape a striking, abstract, expressionist look. And then another community that I really came to love in the coastal plain was the longleaf pine wiregrass savanna. And I came to love those savannas, particularly those at Greenwood Plantation, a 4,000-acre tract in southwest Georgia, just outside Thomasville. Here, a 700-acre stand of old-growth longleafs, known as the Big Woods, provided a reminder that there were once 92 million acres of longleaf dominated landscapes in 9 southeastern states. Less than 1/100% of those old-growth longleaf pine forests remain, a figure similar to the amount of original prairie remaining in the state of Iowa. And I had a really special night, 24 hours in the longleaf pine forest at the Big Woods in August of 2001. I and my dog Zeus at that time came down and spent 24 hours as guests of the Green Tree Foundation. We camped out on the property. It was awe-inspiring to know that some of the longleafs swaying gently above our little one-man, one-dog tent were more than 400 years old. They would have been 2 centuries old when Beethoven wrote his Fifth Symphony. The straight trunk pines in the big woods may be as close as 5 feet or as distant as 80 feet apart. Beneath them is a luxuriant cover of varied grasses, with the fine-bladed wiregrass as the lead species. A collection of forbs, the broadleaf flowering plants with jewel-toned flowers, mingles among the grasses, with 20 or more species growing in a single square meter. The plant community is the most diverse in any in the Southeast. From early spring to late fall, an ever-changing array of color flecks drift through the grasses. And flecks is the key here, F-L-E-C-K-S, is the key here, as dots of color constitute only 5% of the scene at any one time, typically. This is a lesson in the dramatic potential of subtlety. Lacking intense solid color extravaganzas like those provided by mass of one showy species, the longleaf pine community displays a relay of changing color flecks in the matrix of fine textured grasses. Lying in the little tent in the big woods that night with Zeus at my feet and the sound of an ever so gentle adagio of wind in the pines above, I felt tears running down my cheeks. My emotion reflected sadness over what we had lost, as well as the joy of knowing that these woods were still here, thanks to the foresightedness of people who continue to protect them. And that's another theme that sort of runs through the book, is the importance of protecting natural areas, both for the intrinsic value, the fact that we have species there that will be crowded out if we don't protect them, but also because they become a source of inspiration and information for those of us who deal with landscapes, and they can inform our landscapes and make them much richer. So a couple of things come out here. One, the importance of field study, but also the importance of protecting those places which we can study, natural areas which otherwise might have disappeared. And let's see. Oh, and then the Okefenokee Swamp became one of our favorite field trip sites in our 3-week course. Before I get into the Okefenokee, I'll get a little water. And some of you in this room have been there, many of you have been there, I'm sure. Some of you have been there with my class. I fondly remember touring through the Okefenokee's Chester Prairie and Grand Prairie, pulling up alongside a particular plant species in our canoe and using my oar to point it out to students. We learned so much more this way than from studying photographs and books, and we had a whole lot more fun. One November, I made a solo trip to the Okefenokee and was thrilled to hear the primordial sound of a male alligator bellowing, part of a courtship ritual. So during the following summer's field course, I promised the class that once we were out in the middle of the swamp, I would do the bellow for them. So once we were well into Chester Prairie, I made good on my promise, starting with the low guttural sound and then crescendoing. And it was flattering to hear very soon other bellows approaching our cluster of canoes. But fortunately, none of the guys coming toward us challenged me to a duel. But I think with the benefit of the microphone here, I really need to do the alligator bellow for full effect, even though we don't have the Okefenokee Swamp to go with it. So anyway, it goes something like this. It's pretty impressive. Okay. Anyway, before too long, I got over my guilt about being seduced by so many Southeastern landscapes and became ever more appreciative of the people who have had a role in preserving and protecting wild landscapes. These include not only presidents like Teddy and Franklin Roosevelt, Jimmy Carter, but also dedicated individuals at many levels of government, as well as non-government agencies such as the Nature Conservancy and a growing number of other conservancies across the country. We are indebted to everyone who has played a role in protecting threatened natural areas. These remarkable reserves are not only the province of natural diversity and biotic richness, but also sources of great beauty, the beauty of the wild, which inspires and sustains us. All right. Now, another little theme that recurs a little bit in the book is the connection between music, and landscape. And in the mid-'80s, when I was at Georgia, I began to use music in my own design work, playing different types of music appropriate to the project at hand. I let Philip Glass's Low Symphony guide me toward a design for the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Competition. The tension in one movement in that symphony helped me come up with a design that attempted to portray Dr. King's struggles en route to the passage of the Civil Rights Act, and then the resolution that came with his mountaintop speech. I didn't win the competition, but I enjoyed the process. And in my undergraduate design classes and graduate design studio, I began to ask students for quick conceptual design studies, like you see all around you, often multiple concepts for one site, inspired by music. After demonstrating the method, I encouraged the students to experiment with the technique using chalk pastels on multiple overlays. Rather than ambient background music, I chose dramatic pieces like the Low Symphony or the Love Movement from George Duke's Muirwood Suite. Some of you heard that this morning. And the aria Nessun Dorma from Puccini's Turandot, which really soars. And it does get you flowing. I also, and again, my favorite piece for design inspiration remained the Moldau, which inspired these that you see on the wall. Smetana's portrayal of the river flowing through Czechoslovakia that had moved me as a college freshman. In 1995, I did a fairly big project with the National Park Service on managing earthworks in Civil and Revolutionary War sites, and there I was able to draw on natural plant communities again, and maybe especially grassland communities for that work, which was used by the National Park Service in guiding management of sustainable earthworks. Oh, but I also, in 1992, I was invited to Austin, Texas, to be on the design team for the National Wildflower Research Center, which was originated by Lady Bird Johnson. First night I was on the site, I camped out on the land to get a better feel for it, to hear the sounds and smell the smells, and see the sun come up in the morning. And it does really give you a stronger sense of the place. And just lying on the ground in a place seems to give you a connection with it. Oh yeah, and Lady Bird Johnson was kind of enthralled by the idea that I slept on the land where the Wildflower Center would be. And a few years later, 1995, I was teaching a 2-week course at the Wildflower Center, and Lady Bird invited me out to the ranch for a weekend. And and there was a big reception when I was there, and Lady Bird was meeting people, and she'd had a stroke and her eyesight was failing, so I didn't know if she would remember me or recognize me. So as I got to my place in line to say hello to her, I said, "Mrs. Johnson, you may remember me. I'm Darrel Morrison." And Lady Bird Johnson responded, "Of course I remember you, Darrel. I tell all my friends how you slept on the land," which was nice to hear from her. On another occasion, I was at the ranch, and in the afternoon, I did a watercolor sketch of a live oak on the ranch. And after dinner that evening, I gave it to Mrs. Johnson as a little thank you for the dinner and the weekend. And she was her gracious self thanking me and then recalling, somebody else gave me a painting when we had him here for dinner. After a brief lapse of memory, she turned to her daughter Lucy and said, "Who was that, Lucy?" Lucy said, "Mother, that was Marc Chagall." And I always thought that my painting was probably in a box somewhere, but I've been told by people who have been there since then that my painting is in the dining room. Okay. Well, one of my all-time favorite projects is the native plant garden at the University of Wisconsin Arboretum. Interestingly, I did that when I was living in Georgia after I had left Wisconsin. But in summer of '97, I spent a lot of time, a couple of weeks in Madison, getting to know the site, a 4-acre site around the visitor center, to create a native plant garden. And there were a number of requirements. One was to represent 12 different native plant communities of southern Wisconsin in this 4-acre site. And so I had to match plant species with habitat, had to change the habitat in a few cases to accommodate those plants. But it was just a wonderful experience, and I recommend you go see it sometime. It's in the book fairly extensively. Well, anyway, in this case, they wanted 12 different plant communities represented as sort of vignettes of the real community. And in those 12 communities, there were 400 species that were considered sort of key to those communities. So I had the plant list of 400 species before I did the plan, which is kind of not what we always do. We usually do the plan, then we develop the plant list. But here we had the plant list first, and I found places for all of those plants, trees, shrubs, and so forth. So forth. Once I had really identified the different environmental types on the site, my first move in actually form giving was a mass space plan. And to any students in the group and others, I recommend that even yet, do an overall mass space composition before you get into naming plants and doing detailed design. And again, many of these conceptual drawings on the wall would be the first step toward a mass space plan, with the masses being the trees and intermediate shrubs and so forth, things that are eye level or somewhat higher. And then the spaces are the walkways. If there's any mowed area, that would be a space probably. And so that overall framework then gives you a place to match the species with the habitat, and also create experiences for people. In the mass space plan, I often would try to have places where people would be under a canopied landscape and come out into an opening, and then go back into a canopied landscape, and then maybe out into an opening again. And it really is useful. And again, music is really a great help in doing that. And then in about 2002, I guess, 2003, I left Georgia. Well, I guess I actually left in 2003, yeah. And my next place was New York City, a very different type of place. And I loved it as well. And I will talk a little bit about a design I did. I think last night somebody asked how small an area could you do a native planting in and have it be effective. I did a project for New York University right off Washington Square, a site that was 2,200 square feet, which is 1/20th of an acre, basically. And there we did a native forest planting, but we basically did understory trees and then ground layer plants. The main tree in this small area was Carpinus caroliniana, which many of you know, the musclewood or blue beech. And then drifts of various ferns, forbs that grow in a northeastern forest. And these were all drawn from a list that had been developed by a guy named Eric Sanderson in a landmark book called Mannahatta, The Natural History of New York City, drawing on the work of a botanist. And he had identified a list of 627 plant and animal species that were probably on Manhattan Island in 1609 when Henry Hudson arrived. And our little garden was put in 2009, the 400th anniversary of Henry Hudson arriving there. And it's not an easy job putting a woodland ground layer in a very busy place. And probably 10,000 people a day walk through this little park, which is another good reason to do it. And one thing I really liked about the fact was, oftentimes people will say to me, well, it's okay to use native plants, but you can't really use them in the city because it's so different. Well, there are shaded areas in nature, there are shaded areas in the city, and there are sunny areas in the city, and there are reflective areas in the city. And so you can do these things in the city too, and even in a compressed form, I think. And let's move on quickly to Brooklyn Botanic Garden. And I love this garden because I designed it, and it's basically immediately adjacent to Flatbush Avenue in Brooklyn. Flatbush Avenue at that point is depressed, so you don't really see it when you're in the garden. But I just think it is so great to have these many native species representing the pine barrens of New Jersey and Long Island in Brooklyn, New York, and also representing Hempstead Plain, which is a native grassland on Long Island. There were 40, 50,000 acres of grassland on Long Island, and the remaining area of that natural grassland is 38 acres. So we had every reason to bring it back into the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, partly so those species have a place to live, but also just to remind people of what that landscape might have been. First garden was designed in 1911, and then which was a very taxonomic garden with plants organized by family and species. Then there was a redesign done in 1931 by a guy named Henry Svensson, chief botanist, who created an ecologically themed garden. This is in 1931, about the same time that the native prairies were being restored at the University of Wisconsin Arboretum. And then in 2011, 100 years after the first design was done, the garden invited me to do an expansion of that original native garden. And in this case, like in many others, I worked with a botanist. Talked a bit about this last night, how we need to work with scientists, ecologists, and botanists. In this case, I worked with a botanist, horticulturist named Uli Lorimer, and I'll say just a little bit about him. Once again, an important preparatory step for me was to work with a plant scientist. Uli Lorimer was then curator of the existing native flora garden and had extensive knowledge of eastern grasslands and pine barrens. Uli and I made multiple field trips to the remnants of the tall grass prairies of the Hempstead Plains. There were many similarities between those eastern grasslands and the Midwestern prairies I'd worked with before, but there were also differences. These prairies were on the outwash of glacial sediment deposited on Long Island 100 centuries ago. Before European settlement began, this was a landscape of ocean-like waves of big bluestem, little bluestem, Enya grass, and switchgrass, with flecks of color provided by a sequence of forbs such as wild indigo, butterfly weed, blue-eyed grass, mountain mint, asters, and goldenrods. All right. And on one occasion, this is not from the book, but on one occasion, the first summer after we planted, in 2013, I was helping Uli do some weeding. They were short-staffed, and so I did a little weeding one day, and I was sort of buried in an area of native plants with bees buzzing all around me and butterflies, and it was just idyllic. I couldn't think of a richer experience than being surrounded by those plants that were all around me. And as I was there was a little boy who entered the garden at that point, and I heard him say to his daddy, "Look, Daddy, a cactus, a cactus." And it just made me feel so good that a Brooklyn kid was seeing prickly pear cactus in Brooklyn, 100 feet from Flatbush Avenue. All right. And I skipped right over Storm King Art Center, and I won't read about that, but that's been a great experience for me. Storm King Art Center is a 500-acre sculpture park, an hour and a quarter north of Manhattan, in the Hudson River Valley. And my job there was to replace many acres of lawn turf grass with tall grasses and related forbs in some cases. And it's just been a wonderful experience. So the whole landscape now has become a sculpture with the big swaths, big zones of tall grass interspersed with riverways of mowed lawn and turf, but far less mowed turf. And then again, the experience of the movement of grasses and the light coming through them on sunny days. I had a great private client as well in Wilton, Connecticut, someone who had an architectural icon for a house, a round house, sort of looking a bit like a flying saucer on a pedestal. And the client in this case wanted to convert the suburban landscape, the mowed landscape they had all around the site, to a much more native one without herbicides and without a lot of toxins. My client in this case is one who Jens Jensen would have really liked. In Jensen's book, Siftings, he said, clients are of all sorts. There are those with a real understanding of landscape. Those with a real understanding of landscaping are the very, very few. Some know too much or have an idea they do, and they are better left alone. Then there are those who want a garden because their neighbor has one, and that, I'm afraid, are those in the majority. But there are the few who have a real love for growing things, and this client was one of those. She has an eye for beauty and art, architecture, and nature, and sees it not only in plants but in other living things, like the chickens she cares for, the birds, butterflies, and bumblebees that now flit and fly through the 6 acres surrounding the house. And I've continued to work with that client ever since we planted that starting about 8 years ago. And I will mention also something that some of you heard me talk about last night. Neither that client nor myself is enamored with cultivars of native species, the nativars. We just don't think there's that much reason to mess with what we had before we got here. And on one occasion, she really got into the spirit of that, because I recommended on one occasion planting some elderberry shrubs in a moist area adjacent to a pond. When the nursery delivered a variegated cultivar of the elderberry, she sent them back. And I do remember one of my most recent times there, actually sitting under the house on the circular terrace, overlooking the ever-changing landscape in front of us. And we were surrounded by dozens of plants on the slope in front of us, alive with butterflies and bumblebees. We mused that the roundhouse was now more than a half-century old, and it seems futuristic, floating above the landscape like a flying saucer. And we agreed that the landscape now is forward-looking in its own way, too. While it seeks to reintroduce native species and beauty from an earlier era, it is ahead of conventional 21st century landscapes, those outdated designs that depend on chemicals, irrigation, and fossil fuels to keep them in a controlled, manicured, unchanging state. The roundhouse is a living, evolving demonstration of the abundance of life, an ecosystem where we can emulate in which we could emulate in a quarter acre or on a rooftop planting area. The roundhouse landscape demonstrates that doing what is good for the earth and what is good for the birds, butterflies, and bumblebees is good for us, too. Now I'm going to finish up with a little time in Montana. Starting in 2006, I had the good fortune of becoming a consultant on a large ranch on the east front of the Rockies in Montana, planting projects around the building complex, but also restoration around some ponds and outer landscape. And one of my more recent visits there was in late August of 2017. I read a little bit from sort of a diary I wrote on one day, starting in the morning and ending in the evening. So in the morning, as I was waking up, from my west-facing window of the ranch guest house is a view of gnarled limber pines. Some are dead, with rough-textured gray trunks and bare branches, and some are living, with clusters of short green needles. The reddish light that washed the Rockies to the west when I first awoke this morning has progressed through stages of orange, gold, and yellow. A warm tone remains on the grassy hillsides, which have not seen rain in nearly 2 months. There's movement everywhere. A magpie lands in the upper branches of a nearby tree and begins to pluck pine nuts out of a cone, and then moves on to another and another. The pine branches bob, and the clumps of narrow-bladed grasses beneath them sway in the wind. The thick, brittle leaves of an arrow-leaf balsam root rattle just outside my window. A perky striped chipmunk scurries across the rocky ground, leaps effortlessly onto the cut stump of an ancient limber pine, and suns himself on the warm, flat surface. A white butterfly flits by. I step outside my room onto a raised stone terrace with 2-inch tall silver sage plants and flat mats of pussy toes growing in the spaces between the gray to brownish stone slabs. Over a decade has passed since I first designed these terraces. I walked down 5 broad stone steps on the west side, past the clump of crisp, rattling balsam root leaves and the perky chipmunk's sunny pine stump. A 2-foot-wide, dry-laid stone path winds through the clusters of dwarf gnarly pines to the west. I remember how much fun it was to lay out that path, placing colored flags through the clumps of pines, alternately in the open and then enclosed in a small pine grove, and then out into the open again. Sunlight and shadow, prospect and refuge. The curves in the narrow path are not broad river-like curves, but are those of a winding stream. There's a bit of mystery where low-branched pines partially block the view, then open up to reveal blue-gray mountain peaks on the distant horizon. Next, a circular wall is revealed, a council ring, 12 feet in diameter with a 3-foot entrance portal. Anyway, inside the ring, lichen-covered slabs are loosely distributed with tiny, fine-textured grasses, dwarf blazing stars, and other diminutive plants growing between them. Similar species are sparsely sprinkled in the gravelly soil outside the ring, and flat horizontal junipers, surprisingly green, provide colorful accents throughout. During my first exploratory walks into this area, pre-path and pre-council ring, I felt humbled by the composition of beautiful tiny plants in this harsh, dry environment. I remember thinking that I had never designed anything this beautiful. When it came to time to do the remedial healing planting then along the new pathway and seeding area, I made every effort to use species that were already present. Now I'm pleased that it is impossible to see my design or to differentiate between the plants were introduced as plugs and those that were already here. Invisible design. And then I go on for a while and talk about the difficulty of restoring wildness to a place that has been modified by humans. But anyway, the ranch owners and ranch managers fully appreciate the challenges and complexity of rewilding disturbed landscapes and are responding with a range of practices. These include overseeding problem planting areas with desirable native species, experimenting with cutting and mowing strategies, and introducing native plants known to be allelopathic, capable of exuding chemicals that suppress unwanted competitors. A bison herd is permitted to graze periodically in the building complex area. Now, as we close down here, it's almost sunset time. I walk the winding pathway through the limber pines to the council ring. The pine shadows are lengthening as I sit on a rustic circular wall. A chipmunk pokes through a tiny opening between the rocks and pauses to look quizzically at me. What is he doing in my council ring? As I look westward, the sun is just above the horizon. The diminutive grasses, backlit with golden light, are luminous. They continue to bob in the light evening breeze. The air is taking on a chill, a hint of fall. As the sun sets, I sense a sense of well-being settles over me. I feel infinite gratitude for the privilege of working with clients who love this place and have made provisions for its protection and preservation, ensuring that the beauty of the wild will live on here in perpetuity. Thank you. Thank you. Now, any questions, observations? Anything? Yes,
When you slept at the site, at the Wildflower Center, did you sleep open air?
I was in a tent.
You were in a tent.
I borrowed a tent.
I haven't done much open air, but that might have been.
That would be.
And do you remember what the surface was like that you were on?
It was kind of semi-gravelly Texas Texas Hill crunchy soil. Good.
I can repeat, yeah. If the natural disturbance would be bison grazing and fire, how do you replicate that in an urban environment?
Good question. And well, I have burned in some urban areas, but limited. You cut, you mow or cut to reduce the growth of woody things that might interfere with your herbaceous planting, for one thing, certainly. I'm not a big fan of chemical removal. And I've learned among some species, it's better not to pull the plant, but it's better to cut it at the ground, because when you pull the plant, you create a new disturbance, providing a great habitat for more invasive plants. And I will mention, relative to Montana, we don't burn there. They get so little rainfall and there's not that much buildup of biomass, so there's not much need to burn there. There would have been sometime, probably lightning fires. We've not experienced that yet, but it could happen. Mm-hmm.